now for, I think, either 11 or 12 years, as a town and as a community, leaned on our reserve funds to balance budgets that have largely been level service, reactive budgets, absent critical and reactive staff adjustments. On the expense side of the ledger, we've reorganized departments to reduce our spending. We transitioned employee insurance to state offerings to save money. We've aggressively pursued energy efficiency to save utility costs. We've negotiated more conservative wage agreements and implemented slower wage growth scales to slow our wage growth. And at the same time, we've been working to make real strides in rebuilding our stabilization fund to prepare for the next recession, because one will happen, while also trying to limit our use of free cash and one-time money in the operating budget. So this is kind of laundry list of challenges, which is why I wrote it, because I won't remember it all. It translates into what we've experienced this year, which is increasingly difficult and painful budget cycles, and what we've seen so far has been emblematic of that. So at the last pass of the budget, at our hearings that we all attended together with the Finance Committee in March, we refined some revenue estimates and began the process of reducing departmental budget increase requests, and the deficit at that time stood at approximately $1 million. Wendy and I have been working with our department heads. We've been working with Dr. Cabral, Maryland, to review the necessary steps that we must follow in order to produce a balanced budget and what those last steps will be. So while I don't have the budget balanced, because obviously there's outstanding items, I can tell you that we've refined our revenue estimates based on the most recent collections data available. Thankfully, some fixed expenses are being revised downward. We will have zero snow and ice deficit. That is very helpful. Our employee insurances came in at a really, really advantageous rate, so that our employee insurance for town and school retirees will be going up by 1.28%, roughly.
What did we have in the budget?
5%, but that was, I believe, the March revision included this positive news about the fixed,
Got it.
The insurances.
Did $303,000
Yeah.
benefit?
Since March, I brought it up in March, and Wendy and I have looked at it. We are proposing to use some capital stabilization funds to mitigate a one-time peak in debt service to help alleviate some of that burden of the revenue deficit. However, even with those highly advantageous factors, challenges on the revenue side of our ledger, including the narrowing growth of our local receipts, and most notably state aid, will necessitate further reductions in our operating budgets. So the most recent iteration of state aid, I passed out a cherry sheet just so everyone has a copy. I'm sure everyone here has already probably looked, but I think it's really important to have in front of us. The most recent version of the state's budget for fiscal 2020, the House Ways and Means budget, proposes an increase to state aid to Easton of $238,000 roughly, or about 1.8%, which in a vacuum sounds a little bit better than perhaps what we've seen in recent years. However, there's some really important context there, namely that I think about 100,000 of that increases the reimbursement for charter school assessments, which gets to the other side. The state, in addition to providing revenue to the town, also assesses us, and that's on the back of this cherry sheet in front of you. And so while our state aid in the current budget proposal is slated to increase by about 1.8%, our assessments are proposed to increase by a staggering 49.5%, overwhelmingly being driven by charter school assessments. The increase to our state assessments next year as a community and school district is $413,000. So the result is a net decrease in state aid available to Easton next year of $174,000, give or take. So given that we have other revenue challenges, we have fixed revenue on the taxation front under Prop 2.5, and local receipts, while growing healthily, have been stabling off. Having our second largest source of revenue, which is state aid, have a net reduction, not stagnant, not poor growth, we're moving backwards, is extraordinarily challenging. So accordingly, with those adjustments, the positive things on the fixed costs, some adjustments to revenue, application of some capital stabilization fund money for the debt service budget, we are left with a need to reduce town and school operating budget requests by about $445,000. Not each, thankfully, but in total, to achieve a balanced budget. Wendy and I have identified about $200,000 on the town side to cut, which will result in a town operating budget increase of just about 2.1%. The initial departmental request was 3.3. And I'm gonna turn it over to Dr. Cabral to touch on where the schools are at.
If I could, one quick question before we transition. What was the recommended amount of use of the capital and stabilization funds for the one-time peak?
250,000.
I'm sorry, I actually was gonna ask about that. Could you explain that again about the one-time peak and the,
So the debt service for fiscal 20 is a peak year for the debt service.
okay,
It's a significant increase, but it's gonna be followed off by debt that's gonna come off the books.
right,
So that will help to mitigate that peak year.
okay, that's what I thought, but I just wanted to be sure, because you were talking so fast, you mentioned peak, I was like,
I'm
what's,
sorry.
okay, that's okay.
So the rationale being there, ideally, we use one-time money for one-time things, so we have,
Ideally. yes.
ideally. So we have a peak year for debt service at, a portion of that, about 250,000, will not recur next year, so it makes good, consistent financial sense to.
That's the school debt that's falling off, is that what's falling off? Or is
No.
that-
No,
So
no.
that's not part of the debt.
This is not-
No, and
Okay.
it's not the exempt debt,
Not the
that
exempt
would
debt.
have an impact.
Right.
I wouldn't think so, okay, I just want to make sure that
Yep.
okay, so what is causing it to fall off?
There's just several items from bond issues that are gonna mature in fiscal 20.
Oh, okay.
It's not any one particular thing, it's a bunch of different things that we borrowed for that will be paid off.
Oh, okay, good.
Thank you, sorry.
But the debt service does include that additional funding that you've been borrowing for DPW for the last 5 years or whatever, the $500,000 a year, or
Well, yeah, the debt service budgeting includes principal and interest payments on all outstanding
debt,
debt
right,
for
right. So
everything in the
definitely-
community, school projects, roadway borrows that we've
small
done.
things are falling off, but we've been adding some big things over the last few years. Okay, just asking, thank you.
I-
That's it, thank you.
Okay. So I won't give as detailed a background as Connor did for the school department, because we've had really 2 iterations since I made my presentation to the joint committee and also to the school committee. If you remember, we had originally come up with several different targets. We came up with actual numbers for the strategic, the reactive, and the strategic, the proactive, and the reactive. And we came to the conclusion that the reactive was gonna be the most possible for us at this time. It wasn't what we recommend, of course, based on the needs of the district, but that came out to 3.08% increase over last year. And when that was presented, it was presented as being a combination of reactive regressive budget. And the reason was, while we were cutting a great deal of things from the operational budget, we were also looking to add some really critical positions, such as an adjustment counselor, reading specialists, English language teacher, and I explained the reasons for those needs. Since that time, we knew that there was still a deficit, and that the town did not yet have a balanced budget. We just didn't know how much we would need to then continue to cut. After meeting with Wendy and Connor, I then reported to the school committee that if we took off those reactive items, and we did not get an adjustment counselor or the English language teacher or the reading specialists, that would save an additional $170,000. So I reported that back to them, and I reported to the school committee. They did not vote on that though. The last vote they had was the 3.08%, because it was clear in our meeting that there may need to be further cuts after that. And so that's what I'm reporting on Thursday to the school committee. So we're purely in a regressive budget now, we're just going backwards, and, it still is unbalanced. So in the last meeting we had, the town requested that we look at another $70,000. And I met with the cabinet this morning, the leadership team, tried to come up with some possibilities. What we have to look at now, of course, is the operating budget, because we're already in full regressive. And so on Thursday, I'll be presenting some options to the schools committee, and then hopefully by the end of that meeting, we will have a vote at a new percentage that we can then report back to Connor and see where we are at with the town bottom line.
So I just think it's important, I know we've talked about this before, but I think it's important for everyone to realize that in addition to not adding those critical needs, we've already cut 5 teacher positions, 1 at Center School, 1 at Richardson Olmsted, 1 at EMS, and 2 at the high school. We've cut 2 library assistants, meaning jobs lost. We've cut hours for a night custodian in the library and office clerks. So I want everyone to realize that it doesn't just mean we're not adding, that we're actually cutting existing services to our students. That's before the additional $70,000, and so I think it's important everyone knows that.
I agree.
So I have a couple questions, if you don't mind. So as we just said, we're cutting existing services. I know all the other town departments are hurting right now. Nobody's able to get what they need in terms of staffing or maybe equipment and services. And I know you've identified a big chunk of money to cut from the town departments. How do you come up with like where it gets cut? Like, are you looking at the budgets and saying I know you're asking for ABC, but we can't add that? How did you come up with that? Could you just give maybe a little background on
Sure,
that?
so it depends on the department, but so the first place that we always look is we have departments who know that they have needs that are unmet, and they typically will ask early in the process, and frequently I will cut those from a request before it is even delivered publicly. This year, so the first things that we looked at were the 38th officer for the police department that the police chief has been requesting every year since he has been appointed as chief. We removed that. We also, to get to this number, removed the requested half-time person for the fire department. They have 2, 3 budgeted, 2 currently there for the administration of the entire fire department, so we removed that. And then you get to a level service that's already not meeting the needs, and you find other areas that you are hopefully able to reduce the spending. So we'll be making expense cuts for supplies for the town. We will be cutting the health and community services budget, which includes veterans benefits. Part of the rationale of that department being reorganized was to try and help find appropriate benefits for folks. And thankfully, they've done a very good job. They've been very tight fiduciary managers of that, so we're going to cut the veterans benefits, not cutting benefits we legally must pay, but cutting it to be much tighter to actuals. We have had some good timing with retirements. I don't mean to make that sound like I'm happy people, but sometimes that does work out. So we've been able to reduce significantly a few of our departmental budgets due to retirements being replaced at significantly lower salaries. So those are the main areas where we were able to cut. Everything else is the services that have existed for years. So.
Well, I guess that's what I'm asking too, is are these cuts, are they affecting the services, are they affecting the ability to provide services for the town? Or are they keeping it kind of level where it is, which obviously isn't where it needs to be? Or are you having to actually cut services to the town?
I think it would be more appropriate to say it's level service. The level is not adequate to meet
Right, no, I
service
completely
demand.
understand that.
But I at this stage, couldn't point to a specific program and say that's being canceled.
I just wanna say, I think that it's awesome that we ask questions like that in this forum, because the reality is, we're all facing challenged departments, budgets, we all know why, to the point that we believe it's wallpaper. And if we can't feel comfortable asking challenging questions here that probe and prod and challenge assumptions, then I think it makes us feel more confident that the product we do present to the people of the town has been vetted, it has been thought through, we're trying to weigh the greatest value to each of the community members. And I know we all do that individually, and I know that you folks do it professionally in many ways, that we may not, or people in the community may not. So I appreciate the fact that you kick around the numbers the way you do, but being able to talk about it, I think, we have to be comfortable, because they're difficult conversations. They're being had in our community, so we should be able to have them here, and who knows, maybe somebody will look at it in a different way, or kick over a different stone, and it might lead to some opportunity in these challenging times until we can get to a place where we need to.
I think that, I'm sorry. I just wanna say, I think that's important, because I think people, like you said, it becomes like wallpaper. And they're just cutting the fat, they're just, and I think people really need to understand that we are in a position now that we are cutting services. And I really think that we need to make sure everyone understands that.
Well, to build on that point a little bit, what I hear you asking is, we're saying in this budget so far that we are going to reduce the education that we provide to our students. We're giving them less this year than they had
It's not level
previously.
service.
Right,
It's
exactly.
not level service.
And implied in the question
children.
is, have we asked for similar reductions in fire service, police service, DPW, et cetera? And the reason why I think that that's an important question isn't an us versus them question, in any sense. It's the analysis that happens where we treat the school committee budget is itself a line item. It's a number where the town looks at it, whereas the town looks at the police as all of the detail of the police budget, because it rolls into the town number, whereas the school committee budget, it rolls in just as a number. I think that's where you were coming from with the question, is does any of that loss of service, does that come through when the analysis is a line item versus a fully fleshed out budget?
And we do get the fully fleshed out budget. I mean, the book is always huge of the schools.
Yeah.
So we have access to that. But,
Of course.
budgets are, and absolutely, Caroline, next. Budgets are a very tricky and difficult thing, right?
Oh, yeah.
Because it's negotiations and all the lines that happen below, and inputs and outputs. And so it's very hard to have a high level discussion about all the details that everybody probably feels uniquely.
Oh, yeah.
Caroline, I'm sorry, go for it.
Well, no, I'm just, first of all, I want to push back a little bit. There was sort of an implication that we haven't felt free to ask questions that make people uncomfortable. I want to assure you, I've always felt free to do that in the budget subcommittee, but you haven't been around as long.
It's great to have these conversations.
No, I know,
So
I
there's
know,
no
I know,
implication.
I know.
I would never have a hidden agenda, Caroline. I'm far too open and transparent for that.
No, I just wanted to point out that, I'm always,
Nothing to
I've been
point
here
out.
for a long time, so
Good.
I'm not hesitant.
Good.
So just to kind of continue in the path that I've been on for a while. So basically, we also have retirements that we're depending on, correct? To fund the shortfall, so to speak. I mean, we've done that, and this goes to your point that, we just see a line item. So we're talking about, that was a great question. How did you do that? Because that's exactly what I was thinking. So how did you make those reductions? Because we've done all those things. We've also cut positions. We are providing the children in our town a lesser level of service, a lesser level of education this year, especially if we cut any more than we have for many years, maybe for decades. So that's, to me, unacceptable. I probably won't be voting with the crowd, maybe, I don't know, you can't signal your vote ahead of time, I know. But I just feel like I know it's not us versus them, but we've used all those strategies and more. We've already made actual cuts. So it's not a question of not adding these very critical positions. I mean, I know that you're all very well aware of the huge uptick in, mental health issues for our children. This is a nationwide phenomenon. It's certainly not limited to Easton, but, things like an adjustment counselor are considered absolutely critical to meeting the needs of our kids. We're not meeting the needs of our kids with this budget already without further cuts. So, just want to point that out. I wish you had had some sort of magic trick that you had, employed that we could use, but.
No, unfortunately, I don't. And I think it's important to build on not having this be an us versus them conversation, because the town has absolutely, this is not the first year the town has relied on retirements. It is not a
No, I know.
novel.
I know.
Nor is it the first you have in your budgets.
Do every year.
That's right. We all do. The town does have a level service budget that had other items. For instance, had we had a snow and ice deficit, this would be significantly worse
Oh, yeah.
than it already is. And I don't have anything magic, unfortunately. And what I unfortunately do have is a net cut to state aid. And departments that, including the schools, are growing their budgets very, very, very marginally year over year, which I think kind of goes to the question. And you pointed out that some people may look at a school budget as a line item and say, well, they're getting through. There's no actual reduction in service. But even if you're not adding a position, and you know this as well, if not better than I do, the needs of the kids in your schools and the needs of the community are growing and changing. So even if you keep the same staff number, you're not necessarily, that's not the same thing as keeping up, right? So it's an incredibly challenging circumstance. It's not one I'm happy to be in, and I'm sure that speaks for everyone in the room. Jared?
Jane, I think you had a comment?
Two questions, if I might. So first, I know we're all reiterating this is not us versus them. Clearly it's not, because these conditions were handed to us. I mean, it's not like somebody spent frivolously and suddenly they don't have enough money. But here are my two questions, which is, and I'm asking these about the town, because I already know the answers on the school side. That's the budget with which I am familiar. So I know these answers on the school side. What about raising fees for things? I mean, we've raised fees in the last couple of years on the school side, which we don't like to do because it impacts our most vulnerable kids.
Right.
But could we look at, rather than reducing, raising some of the town side fees a little bit?
We will be.
Get us there.
Yeah, we will be.
Yeah,
We have, we check what our peers are doing quite frequently, and so I'll use my department as a parallel. The selectman's office, I think the total revenue the selectman's office brings in through almost exclusively alcohol licensing is somewhere around $60,000 a year. Our annual license fees that we set, many of them are statutory and cannot be moved, and the ones that are, we've typically been at or above the median. That being said, we may have to look at that anyway, just given the revenue situation. We have a new building inspector coming on board shortly. One of the first things that he and I will be doing is looking at building permit fees as well, which is another area that we have kind of, don't want to say audited, but we've audited and looked at that. We are consistently at or above average. So nonetheless, we're gonna take a look to that because we need to. I do think it's important that on the scale of the town's revenue that our permit fees, similar I'm sure to the schools, are not going to fix a systemic problem of this size. But we nonetheless will be, that is something that we will absolutely be doing. So we look each year, but we may, regardless of what that kind of audit brings back, we may have to be moving forward with some of that anyway.
And mostly I'm asking because I know where we already are with the choices we've had to make to get us to this point. We're talking about, $70,000, $100,000.
Yep.
I'm just trying to imagine, is there another way to get there? without having to make some additional cuts. And so here's my next, and again, this is because I don't know the town side budget as well as I know the school side budget. So is there anything that we can do creatively to shift money out of the operating budget over to capital budget? And so I'm going to use, here's, I know that you do, the road, I'm looking at Caroline because she talked about it a minute ago. The road,
Sure.
so, and I don't know what's in that, the
Okay,
amount that you bond out every.
Yeah, I'd be happy to speak to that.
Obviously, there's no salaries in there.
Correct.
But I would imagine it's supplies and materials and equipment or
Right.
whatever.
Yes.
So is there any way that we could look at increasing what we're bonding out this year to move Leisha, I'm throwing this out, like textbooks or something. Let's move all our textbooks over to that so that we can free up money. And again, I know that this is a stopgap for
Right.
this year or maybe next year. If you're continuing to bond out for the road, maybe we could take a smaller portion and bond out for some school
Sure.
stuff, just to help give some relief to the school side of the budget.
Sure. So it's a good question, and I'll just restate it in case Mike didn't pick it up. Does the town look at shifting costs that are legal to do so from operating to capital? So roadway borrowing is a good example of what that could look like. So roadway repairs are capital. They're a capital investment, but that's a recurring thing. That is maintenance that must be done every year, or ideally would be done every year. We have been supplementing that through borrowing to supplement our Chapter 90 roadway funding, which has been level funded for ever functionally. That's not a scientific analysis, but for a very long time. And we're not going to continue to be able to afford to do that, even on the capital side. So there's already certain things, not even indefinitely. Dave Field's presentation of the 3-year capital roadway maintenance plan assumed the borrow that's already built in for this year, and then not breaking it off to free up more borrow and just ending. So going from $500,000 borrow a year to supplement the approximately $400,000 to $500,000 that we get from the state. The number we need in order just to keep our roads where they are is over $1 million. So even with that kind of creative borrow, we're losing ground much more slowly, but it's still insufficient. So now we're going to go from insufficient with that creative approach to try to reduce pressure on the operating budget, because there could be an argument made that a certain amount of funding recurring in the operating budget for capital things we know we need ought to be programmed into these budgets. That is ideally what we would do. We are not there. So, 2 pieces. 1, yes, we do look at that, and we have done it. And 2, as far as DPW, for now, we are looking, the 3-year pavement management plan that was presented to the selectmen is borrow to supplement state money for this coming year, and then just state money. And so then we're going to be very significantly underfunding our roads.
And just so you're clear, I wasn't suggesting not do that, I was just
No.
trying to figure out,
It's a
could
great-
we also do something like that for the schools?
On a bigger level, is there an opportunity to leverage debt smartly so that it alleviates operational expense pressure now? And that's always a item to be considered. And it's only good if the interest expense
Right.
on that debt
Right.
is better served than the operational expensive savings.
Well, and it's also,
That makes sense.
it's a challenge too, because once you borrow for it, that is a fixed cost. That will be paid before we budget for operating costs. So perhaps in maybe this year, say we shift a $70,000 item that would be paid out of an operating budget and borrow instead. That $70,000 that got freed up in the operating budget will go into the debt service, which will be fixed and accrue interest, and presumably we would be doing that because we needed the $70,000 in the operating, right? So we're kind of borrowing for tomorrow to pay for today, and then we end up in this structural revenue deficit. I'm sorry to bring the wallpaper up, but that's it's a really fine balance. So we do have a relatively conservative amount of debt per capita, but a lot of that is driven by school projects. We obviously have a large, very important, really valuable one coming, which will bring that up, but it is something that we'll be taking a closer look at. We did try to recommend funding for most of the school items in this capital budget this year. We know that those are major, significantly important items.
It's a good budget this year, compared to recent years for us.
God, we could say that
Capital.
about one thing.
Capital, I mean, the capital.
Right. So it's a good question, and we do try to balance that. But Wendy, if you want to add to
Yeah,
that
I
at
just
all.
wanted to say too, that, you know, for those items, all the technology, I mean, we know that that's gonna be recurring every year, so that's not something we would wanna borrow for. And these items, even if we do leverage the debt, I mean, we basically did that back in, I think it might have been 2010, maybe. That's how the capital stabilization fund was initially created. We decided to do that instead of, you know, paying for all of these things. We leveraged some debt, we put money into reserves. It looked better for our bottom line, and so we did that. But now we're at a point where the debt service budget has been growing year after year, and, you know, for this year, we've got that peak year, and we have to put capital stabilization funds toward that to balance it out. We've gotten to the point where, you know, we really have to, you know, be careful with how much debt we do leverage, because you just put it off a year, eventually that is gonna find its way into the operating budget.
As a fixed cost, that will take precedence over perhaps existing resources, which is what's so challenging.
Are there any other one-time items that might be applicable to this year that we should be considering? And I ask that not with a specific question now, but perhaps just as a discussion point over the next coming days as we take a look. I'm sure you've already thoroughly vetted it, but if there are other one-time items that are appropriately could be addressed, that would also be
Specific
know.
on which side of the ledger?
on any side of the ledger. So we're using $250,000 to satisfy one-time debt spike.
Yep.
Is there anything else that is appropriately a one-time item that we would consider? And again,
One-time
doesn't-
operational items that we
Yep.
could capitalize.
Doesn't have, not capitalize, but use the capital and stabilization funds to offset, because it's not indicative of the true run rate of our expense levels. So, I'm sure you've already looked at it, you identified and found this one, but
So-
if there was,
Yeah, I mean, we could do a double check on the town side, but like I'm sure is the case for schools, overwhelmingly our operating budgets are people, and they recur, and their wages go up.
Yep.
People recur.
They do. They recur as a budgetary item. They get,
No, I think that's
Like
very
to.
accurate, I like it.
But we do have one-time items in the school department. Yeah, we do.
then it might be helpful to quantify what those are, at least knowing might provide the opportunity for discussion.
in the operating,
Mhm.
so, yeah, we should.
Yeah, we always have.
So, that's exciting that there could possibly be an opportunity to move things in that direction and use that to resolve it this time. At the risk of beating a dead horse, going back to Jackie's original question, which I think is it is a difficult question, but it's a crucial question. My take from the various budget conversations that we've had is that we're all suffering and not growing all across all departments. We are making decisions though about where to allocate our money. And right now, the budget that we're talking about, as I would characterize it, and I'm open to somebody telling me I'm mischaracterizing it, that I've failed to capture something. But this budget is reducing our education services, but not reducing other services. The question is, that's still out there is sort of why or how did we decide that that was the area in our town budget that we were going to reduce the services? Implicit in that is, why not reduce other services? I'm not making a point by the question that that's wrong. That's not what I'm driving at. It's from a process perspective, from a governance perspective, why did we choose to reduce services there and not other places? And maybe, like I said, may totally be the answer is, you foolish man, we are reducing them all across the board. If that's the case, answer it accordingly,
No.
but.
I'll tell you this, having done budgeting for 15 years, that's a very difficult question to answer because you're asking people, and I'll let you folks jump in, but you're asking people to assess the ramifications of all decisions made for a long period of time that got you to budget this year. In other words,
Yes.
right? So for Department A for 5 years, had no raises, but added 5 people, right? For Department Z, chose not to. But then when you look at a specific year in question, you lose that history over time. One of the things that at least from a high level that normalizes sometimes, is a percentage increase that says, all right, well, of the budget that we have, or a dollar increase, in case there's a different size of dollars of budgets, is helpful. But of the increase on the town side, if we're at 2, or on the school side, if we're at 3, then the discussion says, well, what caused that 3? You know, it might be, you know, on the business side, we have increases in minimum wage and state taxes that have no impact on us. And as a result, we have to cut people in order to maintain a certain level of profitability. And that's a reduction of service to our guests, in my case. But we're still increasing our budget or our cost by 5 points. And people are like, well, we're cutting your service to the guests, but your costs are going up 5%. So I just feel like your question, we can take the time and I'm happy to do it, but that's a culmination of trying to understand, well, what triggered the school budgets to go up the way they did? And what triggered the town budgets to go up the way they did? What were the raise percentages we gave? What were the cost structure increases that incurred? And I'm happy to spend the time, but I know you folks have given presentations that drive a lot of those answers, but that's just a hard one to nail down.
It is far less of a mechanical question that I'm asking, and more of a values question that I'm asking. In the sense that, again, I'm not suggesting that that the values were wrong, that the decision is wrong. I have no reason to suggest that. I'm rather fond of my house not burning down. And what I'm saying is that at some point, Connor was forced into what I think is a horrible position of being asked to negotiate with all the departments to determine how are we going to make this work. That is not Connor's fault that he's been forced into that situation, but at some point a decision gets made, which says I could go back to our police chief and ask for more money, or I could go to Dr. Cabral and ask for more money. And at some point that decision has to be made. And I think what Jackie, correct me if I'm wrong, that what you're asking is what led you to make that specific decision? That when we go, as you said before, to the town and say, we are recommending this budget, how did we arrive at what, you're correct. Believe me, I understand. Budgeting is a dark art.
Right, like some departments might have taken 0 and some raise.
And there's often a marvelous
right, so,
reason for it.
Yeah.
But ultimately a decision gets made, and it's the nature of that decision. Believe me, I've kept up with the mechanics of it.
Because we're all working the issue.
Right, yeah, exactly. And I trust that we are where we are for good reasons. But should somebody come and ask that question, it seems an important one. I mean, that's the sort of thing as town leadership we are forced to grapple with. And so that's why I'm putting it out there.
Yep.
But if I'm just simply taking us down a meaningless rat hole, I will withdraw the question.
It's not meaningless, it's just to Tom's point, and I'm gonna be very careful here to not speak for the schools. It's an incredibly complicated one where and maybe this is because I am a budget maker for a living, I don't agree that there's a separation between mechanical budget approach and values. Budgets are value statements. And the question as to how does the town working with the schools get to a certain number, it is absent one another making value judgments about the allocation of those dollars, you're kind of left with a more mechanical approach, right? To Tom's point. And, you know, you can use the allocation of dollars as a proxy for value, but you could also flip that on its head and say, well, no, that's a reactive allocation of dollars.
Mm-hmm.
So when you look at the town and school operating budgets, right after recession through today, it's been remarkably consistent, actually, that the school, Easton Public Schools have been, if you add those two up, 70% of that in the town has been 30. And the growth of available dollars over those years has not been adequate for the schools to be in, I think, a position where you're being proactive. I think that's fair to say. Nor has it been for the town. And so we are in this kind of challenging situation every year where we're looking at, okay, what's for revenue and what can we do, rather than what do we need to do and how do we fund it, right? And there are decisions made along the way over the course of years by dozens, if not hundreds of people. If you want to be technical and include town meeting, then definitely hundreds of people.
Sure.
That culminate in a moment in time like right now where you kind of, it's very hard to separate all that out. And so what we have traditionally done is look at the revenue available and say, well, if we're going to cut, if cutting needs to happen, obviously that needs to be spread out in a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
And so back in March, when we still had $1 million to go, I spoke with Dr. Cabral and said, well, one way to look at this is the schools are 70 cents of every operating dollar. One could say, okay, you're 70 cents of every operating cut. That is not necessarily what we're talking about. And obviously I'm sensitive to the fact that that needs to go through the school committee process. So the numbers that we're talking about, so if we have 445,000 to go in the town, you know, the scale of budgets matters. The entirety of the town, including public safety, is 17.3 million compared to 42 plus. And that's not a us first event, those are just numbers. And so I think that cutting 200,000 on the town side, which is closer to like 45% of that number that needs to be reduced, when the town is not 45% of the expense burden, nor is it 45% of the growth. I think that's kind of a mechanical approach that I think we've already tried to move towards understanding that these are not just numbers, they have real impacts. You know, the superintendent and I are talking about some ways maybe we can get creative with moving a position to fill something on the town side. We're trying to work collaboratively, but it has traditionally been kind of mechanical, this is how much and this is proportional. That doesn't mean that you would do that, because if we were looking at proportional, then it would be more.
Right.
And I'm trying to be sensitive because I know that this is a really, really challenging situation, but to Tom's point, it's not, I do not feel comfortable, and I don't think it is my place to try to unpack and make a value judgment on a decade of decisions that led to today. I think that where we really are is, you know, typically when you have departments, the largest ones bear the largest cost reductions. That has been true on the town side when we have cut in police, fire, and DPW. And there's some just straight mathematical argument for that.
Sure.
But there's also, we have certain things, you know, we have an IT department of 1. We cannot cut. You know, if we have a clerk's office of 3 and do a cut, then the clerk's office doesn't function. Right. But even that is getting into an area that I don't really feel comfortable saying, because that implicit in that is that the schools aren't cutting a thing, and I know they are. So it's really, really challenging to drill down and say, because then it becomes much more of a value conversation, and then ultimately so what is the value attributed to? If you're in a year where, depending on retirements, somebody can cut the same dollar for dollar without a layoff, do you do a layoff out of solidarity effectively, right?
Right.
Is the question. So it's really hard. It has traditionally been a mathematical, these are the numbers that we need to work with.
And so, I genuinely appreciate that answer, that is the answer to the question that I was asking. And there is, impressive insight, into, for my money anyway, into the challenge that we face, that, and again, I'm gonna say reading between the lines, because that's not what I mean, but understanding the subtext of what you're saying, that the nature of the town budget is different than the nature of the school budget in terms of what proportions of it are fixed, what proportions of it are governed by statute, et cetera, so that you obviously understand that you can't just say, well, historically it's been 70-30, so let's just run with 70-30. But that what you've tried to do is make the intelligent decisions that take into account those different peculiarities of the budget. And I can understand where you're coming from. That was the extent of the question I was asking, was the process that goes into it and the thoughts. So I'm grateful. I am aware that I'm asking a difficult question, and I'm grateful for the answer.
Well, there's some interesting things that happen in the budgeting process that are basically legal, but I'm just gonna go back to the first override I worked on in 1990-ish. And that was an interesting override, but effectively the vast majority of it was for the schools. So that year, our budget went up. The next year, our budget went up quite a bit, I think 6 or 7% or something, and so did the towns. But the following year, the town, you know how it works, you pass the override, it's designated for whatever purpose for that year, but then the next year it just goes into the general revenue fund. So it no longer belongs to the schools. So the following year after the override, we had something like a 0.1%, I mean, some crazy low number increase, because the town effectively found other uses for that money so I know this sounds like a us versus them thing, and that's always a little bit in the mix. But I remember being very frustrated that we were almost back to ground zero in terms of our ability to create a good budget for the schools, because the town was the money was just absorbed into the general revenue. The same thing, I mean, it's still portioned out. I'm not saying that the schools didn't get any of the money. I'm saying that it just becomes part of the general, all the sources of revenue. You're looking alarmed. I'm not suggesting, but.
I think we're getting perilously close to us versus them, Carol.
Okay, well, maybe
And I would
that,
prefer
but,
to
just wanted to
try
say, though,
address this as a cohesive group.
well, okay, but I feel that my job is to really advocate for children. So I'm one of the older people in town, so I know that we talk about seniors being vulnerable, but I still think of children as the most vulnerable population. So I'm just saying there's all sorts of little things that have happened over the years that have resulted in great challenges on both sides. That's just one sort of, little specific example of a time that we took a big hit. Education Reform Act, as all of you know, did great. It provided extra funding for Easton, but it proportionately provided much less extra funding than it did for most other communities, because we were put in the wrong labor market area, because of all sorts of other reasons. And we started out with a very low base. Easton always took great pride in doing, having a great school system for, low funding, which just, my husband used to say, we have a great school system by mutual agreement. It's a good school system, but we haven't, in my opinion, and I love the schools. I haven't been doing this for 27 years because I'm not devoted to them. I just feel like we're not putting our money where our mouth is. We just all sit around and talk about how great things are. And then when we hit a crisis like this, it is a values situation. I don't know what the solution is, but I know that when we did the 2006 override. This was the group kind of that did it. It was the finance committee, the board of selectmen, and the school committee got together, went to 87 coffees, and grabbed people on the street and advocated. And I am going to say that nobody likes to talk about overrides, but this is really ultimately the only solution, because the only time we've been able to catch our breath in the last 30 years have been when we've had successful overrides. I mean, I just don't know where, I'm really feeling quite distraught about the situation with the schools. I feel like I've been doing this for 27 years and we're moving backwards, and that's just outrageous to me. And it's our kids. And I maintain that's the most vulnerable population.
I think it's important. Dawn?
Just out of curiosity, I know that some of the schools are, and I know that Easton isn't, but like Brockton and the gateway cities are trying to do lawsuits to fight against the formula. Is there anything that's happening in our peer group where
Yes.
we can get together with groups and we can go to our legislators or to, the people who are working on the formula? Because my fear is that when they redo the education formula, it's gonna hurt us even more.
You're right.
Yeah, it will.
That's
And
where it's
I'm
going.
wondering what we can do collectively. Who do we need to talk to? What do we need to do? Who do we need to picket? Like, what can we do to try to make change that way? I don't know that people, that are making the decisions really understand what is happening, like, to our budget for, what they consider to be an affluent community, but our circumstances are no different than many other communities, so
They
is there
should.
anything we could do to push that a little more?
So, Connor and I have talked about this as well. We are in a really, it's not just an apples for apples across the Commonwealth, which I know you know because you're bringing it up. The foundation formula is severely flawed. We are not a foundation district, so we're a minimum aid district. That means we get $20 per student. That was raised to $30 per student this year. That's the only increase we received, or may receive, whereas other districts are receiving huge jumps potentially in their foundation budget. We're right in the middle, this weird place with a cohort of districts in this not well-known across the state, that we're in this odd place like I am right now.
I can hear you.
Just trying to give you a visual. Where we are not a foundation school, district. So districts that are foundation districts, like Concord, for example, is a foundation district. They receive foundation funds. They will benefit from the foundation formula change. In addition, their taxpayers pay more money for the education of their kids, so they're getting a twofer. We are not a foundation district, we're a minimum aid district, and we are getting minimum aid, and we are not benefiting from overrides. And our urban district friends are foundation districts, and while their taxpayers aren't paying to fill in with overrides, they get millions and millions in entitlement grants. But because we don't meet certain poverty thresholds, we don't get the foundation, we don't get the overrides, and we don't get the entitlement grants. So we are in a worse position than many of the districts in the Commonwealth. And so I have been tooting that horn, I've been sending that information repeatedly to our representatives, to our senators, and asking them to advocate for this bill and this bill specifically. I forward them to Connor, I forward them to the school committee so they know, what it is I am advocating for. It would be hugely helpful to have more people tooting more horns, because I don't know that they're responsive and they're very understanding, but it's so complicated to explain to people what that means. There are so many nuances to it that you can't even sit here and say, well, they get X amount of dollars and they get X and we get this. Caroline, also brought up something very very quickly, but I'll just explain one thing. She said it very quickly, but it's actually a very complicated thing. Something like a wage adjustment factor. I'll use a neighbor, Mansfield, and us. So there's what's called a wage adjustment factor. It does not, it is one of the components of the foundation budget. And it is not earned income. It's not income. It's not per capita income. It's wage. My wage counts for the town of Easton.
The wage is paid to people that work in the town.
Okay, it's not in my town.
To off, like basically if you commute to Easton to work, that's the
in
number.
Easton,
Right.
those are the wages they look at.
All the people who work in Easton, not people who live in Easton, but people who work in Easton, that comes out to a wage, formula. The average in Easton, I'm gonna try to do this off the top of my head, but it's very close. The average wage in Easton is $45,000. The average wage in Mansfield is $72,000. Because of that, there's a cutoff, it's in the 60-something percent. Because of that, when they're figuring out how much of a percentage you receive, Easton gets 100% reimbursement for our students. Mansfield gets 105% because they get a wage adjustment factor. The theory being, if the employees of that town make more money than towns around you, you need to get more aid so you can pay your staff more to compete with those wages in the town. How do you fix that? Well, you don't do that overnight. You have to bring in high earning wage. Foxborough has a great wage adjustment. Because all of the Patriots count for Foxborough, not where they live, okay?
Sorry.
Seriously, you
Sorry.
build a stadium, I don't know, like,
Well,
you know,
but
bring in high-tech industry or medical facilities or something where people will earn higher wages. That's the kind of thing that works into the foundation formula that you can't just fix. Yes, we should be petitioning people and trying to change things, but that's not something that's gonna change overnight.
That's not even anything, I don't think, in any of the proposals, they're not even
No.
looking at
Right.
those
No,
options.
they're
Right,
not
and-
at all.
There is that,
And-
that per student, isn't there a proposal one of the representatives is making, that instead of
Josh,
$30
Yes.
per student, he's recommending
100. And the Mass Association of School Superintendents, forgive me now because I was not prepared for this conversation, is recommending either 150 or 200 per pupil for minimum aid. That would make a huge difference for us. Because
So could we
the
draft-
foundation
could we
form,
draft a letter that we could put out to the
I'll
public and
forward it to you.
ask the
Yeah,
whole,
I've
ask
sent it,
everybody in
yeah.
the town, ask all these groups, send these letters to this person, and just flood them with letters saying, look, Easton, we need help, and come and evaluate what we're doing.
I
Yeah,
can
great.
forward what I've already written to everyone on this committee. You can take a look at those kinds of things. They're things that I've advocated for from our legislators.
I think it's a point well taken, both by you and by Dottie,
Mhm.
that we need more than just a few of us who
No, I can't,
constantly
yeah.
call our state reps and state
Right.
senators, that we need more people from the community
Mhm.
saying the same thing.
Yes, please.
That has a much more of an impact
Mhm.
than just a few of us making those calls.
Our parents need to be outraged by
Yes,
this.
I agree.
I
And-
don't
and we
know
need
that,
everybody to
yeah,
pitch in.
I don't know that everybody understands what's happening in the schools right now. I don't.
I think it would be helpful to have that letter, because I know it would
I
help
agree.
me to communicate to all of my peer and age group with kids my age, who also have kids, my kids' age, that
Right.
I need you to engage, and that would be
Well,
very helpful.
because in all fairness, the average parent will read what's coming out and say, oh, this is great. Everybody's looking at the foundation formula. Schools are going to
Schools,
benefit.
yes.
That's not including us.
Right.
Two of the three proposals out there do not benefit us.
Right.
Mhm.
And the other
And which
one
is more
marginally.
the same, right? And this is kind of to your point, we're in this kind of forgive my non-scientific terms tonight, Bermuda Triangle. We have a confluence of factors
Yes.
that result on the local level and from money from the state that massively constrain our revenue growth year over year. And we're doing a lot
Yep.
on the local level to try and boost that. But those are 5, 10, 20-year return on investments.
Right.
And there are foundational no pun intended, problems, right?
You could see why someone would say, well, what's so special about Easton? Why are you having such a problem and nobody else is?
Well, because Easton's a beautiful
Because we
town,
don't
and
get
they- and
$12 million in entitlement grants, or,
Right.
you know, we don't get,
Well,
And I'd just like to close a little bit of a loop for the 5 people who actually watch this meeting on cable. The implication for that wage adjustment factor is that we can't pay our teachers 30% less because our wage,
Than
the wage that
Mansfield,
we're,
right.
Right,
than
of course.
Mansfield.
Right.
Or, we can forget it altogether. I mean, so.
Well, right, because job markets don't actually function
Right,
in
they don't
jurisdictional
function. Right,
silos
exactly,
where,
exactly.
you know,
So,
If
but
you're-
that's kind of the ramification of this. The what is? Oh, it's the silos. I think you're being very colorful with your language. I love it. The Bermuda Triangle, the
It is-
silos. I like it.
It is important, a lot of the things we talked about today, even that last part about the job creation and how hard that is for us as a community, right? It really is. There are so many factors, and our taxpayers pay a very high tax rate, right? So,
well, not
and so.
not a tax rate
not a tax rate,
necessarily.
Effectively, the taxes that they pay.
Yes, because
Per capita.
which is part of the value thing that becomes so challenging is because in spite of our challenges, to your phrase, good by mutual agreement, in spite of all these challenges, the schools have done a very good job, the town has done a good job, the volunteers here do an awesome job, and it's a great place to be, which drives property value up. So even though we have a relatively, $15.90-something is not an aggressively high tax rate, but property values are high. And the rate of taxable property is low because part of judgments that have been made through policy over decades is that we preserve space in this town, which is part of why it's a nice town. Preserving space and having Gillette Stadium are somewhat
The opposite.
But you know what, that's why,
in challenge to each other.
to our credit, sewer districts are so critical, and
Yes.
developing any encouraging smart growth is.
It is. It's
hugely critical.
super important, but really to tie back to that, you do end up with these challenges, like with a foundation budget that has a wage adjustment factor that operates on this notion that there are these silos, and that you can, depending on where you are in Easton, you might be closer to a job in Mansfield than you are in town, right? And
Mansfield is considered a Boston labor market, and Easton is considered a Bridgewater Brockton labor market. Totally different.
but when you look at other economic metrics in town, doesn't add up at all. I mean, the cost of housing in Easton, the value of property in Easton, the per capita income of the people who actually live here is is a rounding error of Mansfield, right? And that's why they show up as a comp for us so frequently, is because they have similar population density, similar tax bills. Yet on this one math formula, it is very not advantageous.
And the irony is that when you look at the foundation formula, there are 11 so they basically put like a price on every child's forehead. This is what we think it costs you to educate these children. Special needs student costs this much. An elementary student, a high school student, a vocational student, a student who's low income, and then there are, I think, 6 different levels of low income, right? So they give every child, and they acknowledge that certain children cost more to educate because you have to provide wraparound services, support services, interventions, and so forth. Despite the fact that that is identified, when I talk about things like the entitlement grants, even though they acknowledge.
Excuse me, is anyone on a Honda Blue Accord, navy blue?
Yes,
The lights are on, I just wanna let you know.
thank
Oh.
you.
Alright, yep.
Thanks.
I give you a rep. Even
I
though
have
the,
cables.
state has acknowledged, and part of the funding problems that everybody is arguing is that the price they put on a special needs student has completely eviscerated what they have allocated for that purpose and so forth. But even though it's been acknowledged by everyone, really, that a special needs student or, what have you costs more to educate, these grants that we're not eligible to even apply to have a certain percentage. You have to have 40% English language learners in your district, or you could have 39.5%. And so it's acknowledged that 39.5% is more to educate, but you cannot get those funds to help you, whereas a district with 40 or 41 can. So these are all the things that play into this that And ironically, in order to change that formula, we need to do things like have full-day kindergarten, because our children who go for a full day, but they pay half tuition, the state counts them as a half day, cause they only count what we pay for. So all our kids, when enrollment is very important, cause you get money per student, we only get half for every kindergarten student because of tuition. So full-day kindergarten actually hurts us there. Bringing in what would be considered some vocational programs like robotics or graphic arts or things like that, that require a startup investment, though you get paid far more for a vocational student than you do for, so you'll see all of these things listed in our proactive and strategic budget. I didn't get into them specifically because you can see how complex this conversation is. But all of those things are worked into our budget of strategic things that we know we can do to try to get more funding. But we're going so backwards, we can't even make the ground to make those things happen. So, increasing enrollment, for example, but we don't have room in our schools. That's what other districts are doing.
It's interesting, it's kind of, in a way, similar to the sewer projects that you're putting a lot of money into with the assumption that in the future, I mean, we all assume this, I think it's a great idea, you'll get more funding from businesses and so on. We can't do that. We can't make those initial investments that would lead to really much sooner probably than the sewer projects will, to better funding from the state, but we don't have anything, we're going
Oh,
backwards, as you say.
But
It's
for
very
some
frustrating.
big projects like the MSBA project.
Right,
is
hopefully
a
things
material
like that will
investment that
help.
Well,
along
that
the
would
way
be
enables
huge.
us to,
That
right?
would be
So
huge.
That would be
I mean,
huge.
I think there's alignment that,
Absolutely.
tremendous broad support from a collaborative standpoint, regardless of who you ask, that they all support the MSBA project, understanding the financial implications. So I think that's a great demonstration of the community collaboratively
I hope so.
galvanizing around it.
I love your
hope so.
optimism.
I'm speaking around the people in this room.
I'm invited to speak a lot of places where that's not exactly the
Yep.
sentiment.
Yeah,
I guess what I'm trying to convey is that there are people on the town side and there are people on the school side around a project that's really big for the
100%.
schools
Yeah, I
that
hope
are supporting you and
Yes.
really trying to ensure that the community understands that this is a cross-functional team that
Mhm.
represents all the different constituencies of this town, and we have decided that is the number one financial priority.
and that's a
So,
value, yeah.
As long as we can communicate that to the community
We're
as a
trying
whole,
really hard, yeah.
we,
Yeah.
right, well, we should continue to do that, but my statement was not about how the community feels, it was more about recognizing the leadership in this room, in this town, feels
No,
that
and
is the
I'm
number
not,
one
I don't
priority.
mean to be negative, the only reason I say that is because I don't want people to think, and this isn't what you said,
Mhm.
oh, this is a done deal, we're all set, because I
No,
think
it's
there's a
not.
lot of misinformation still and a lack of information, even though we're all trying so hard to make sure it gets out there, that, and the reason I say that is because it would be, this is a very different conversation if that project doesn't go through,
Certainly.
very different conversation. I'm not sure,
For all parties involved.
for the whole town.
No doubt.
The
Can you
town,
just say
not the
where
school.
people can get information about the school project if somebody's
Yes.
watching this meeting?
Yep, Easton, EESproject.com. That's where all of our workshops that we offer and video tour that we're gonna be putting on there and community forums that we've been having and videos of all our meetings so far, minutes, documents, everything's on there. Easton, EESproject.com.
EES is Early Elementary
It stands
School,
for
Early Elementary School.
Yes,
Yeah.
EES is in San, or school.
Can I just make a comment too about the three proposals that are out there, because I think to Dottie's point, I do think it's a really good idea if we can continue to advocate community-wide for the proposal that we think is best. However, and I'm usually rose-colored glasses, glass is full, overflowing kind of person. The Foundation Review Committee finished their work in 2015. Every year since 2015, there have been proposals through the legislature to adopt changes related to recommendations around the foundation budget. This year are 3. There's one that may benefit for us. I mean, I don't know where your perspective is, Leisha, on the confidence level, but I'm not entirely confident, based on what happened last year, that one of these will even get through. really critical for us to be sending
Right,
letters.
the Mass Municipal Association just sent us a
Mm.
letter detailing where they stand on the issue of foundation budget. And I think it's important for people to read that and to pass that on to as many folks as possible.
And I'm curious, was it the same proposal as what, do we know, I don't know which one the Mass Municipal Association
I
is
didn't, I haven't,
advocating.
I haven't read
There's
it,
three of
yes,
them,
I
there
know.
are three of
Yeah,
them,
but those are three bills.
yes,
This is something separate from that,
from the fund.
from Mass Municipal
Okay.
Municipal Association is saying, this is what we think towns, cities and towns need. So, school and the town side too.
Okay.
So, if I can forward that to you,
Yeah.
if you, okay.
But I think something implicit in a lot of the comments on this is, and not to be pessimistic, but that is something the MMA does each year, that we have done joint letters, we've done these things each year. The state has budget challenges like we do. And so I think it's important to call reps and senators. I think it's important to forward these letters onto them, but you do get things like the MMA's letter. The MMA advocates every year that Chapter 90 is inadequately funded. They advocate every year that Chapter 70 should be reimbursed at a higher rate or paid at a higher rate per student. And even if there are changes to these state level formulas on the margin, because of where we are, I mean, and I have a risk of sounding alarmist, we have been having this conversation for many years, saying that this is where we were heading. I remember helping my predecessor put a budget presentation for town meeting, I think 4 or 5 years ago, that took one of the intro slides from the past decade of budgets, where this exact situation that we were in was stated plainly. We are in a situation of increasing reliance on reserves and positioning ourselves to not be able to continue to fund services. And that was said each year, and we went through every year and kind of culminated to this is where we are at. And I think we even had a graphic one year of a road going in 2 directions. And so we are back to the point of like, there are decisions made. It is not for me to get into making value judgments on the decisions of every single person for the past decade that lead to where anyone is on a given day. And where we are now is where we said we would be. This is what we have been saying for years. And to Tom's point and to this group's point, we've been saying it probably so much that there's a bit of white noise effect, it becomes a wallpaper, or while the budget is balanced, so things must be, but a balanced budget doesn't mean a programmatic budget that meets needs, right?
Right.
We have to balance a budget. That's the law. So we will. But we are getting to the point that we said we would be at, where it's no longer going to be possible to get through each year with reorganizations and reducing staff by moving them somewhere, or, you can't jump into the GIC twice, right? You can't max out net metering credits twice. We are at the point where there's reductions, there's cuts into the bones of some of these departments now, and absent, major systemic change. This is the new normal. This is what we have been talking about for years, and that's from a service standpoint not a good thing, but that is from a fiscal standpoint the reality.
Yeah.
So I think it's important that we engage our partners at the state, but I do not want the takeaway for the 5, maybe 6 people now at home watching this to be, well, they'll make a few phone calls and it will be fixed, because it is a bigger problem and it is more challenging than that.
I think Donnie's point, though, is that we make it a much larger audience.
Yes.
that responds to this.
Absolutely. It's important that people engage with this. It absolutely is. I do not say any of that I hope I did not sound cynical. That's not my goal. But yes, people do need to engage. And it's hard. It's hard for us to talk about this. And this is all of our, well, maybe not jobs, but professions for some of us, 27 years of volunteerism for others. And these formulas are immensely complicated. So when you have folks who are working, 1 or 2 jobs trying to take care of their kids and say, hey, I really need you to get smart on Chapter 70's foundation formula and the delta between a minimum aid and a net school spend, it's so hard and it's so complex. So it is important that we ask folks to engage, but we're in a tough spot.
And the comment that you just made there, I think is really the crucial comment to be made. This is not surprising. We are where we are, exactly where you, people before you, and others have said we were going to wind up. Here we are. It doesn't get better from here under the current situation, even with success. It's, with Dottie's suggestion, those are incremental
Mhm.
at best. So,
Was
I just
there
wanted to echo
capital
that.
budget discussion that you wanted to focus on?
No, the
or
capital,
do you
not
feel-
specifically. I will speak with the superintendent about if there is any opportunity at all to shave on the margins of any kind of one-time thing in a operating budget. But otherwise, the capital budget is as it was presented in preliminary form.
Understood.
There are some, it is inadequate budget by our standards. It is not proactive in meeting all needs, but there are some majorly important things in there for our buildings, funding for the turf for the schools, things like that. So, but nothing specific.
If it's all right with the team, we'll move on to item 2, past operating capital budget discussion. Sound good? May 20th annual town meeting warrant discussion?
Again, this is just a standard business placeholder during this time of year. There hasn't been any dramatic changes to the warrant.
Yep.
I'll happy to answer any questions if anyone has any, but other than that, it's just going through its standard process of review.
I don't have any. Team? All right. Approval of meeting minutes. Did everybody have an opportunity to review the meeting minutes? Michael prepared for us for Monday, March 4th, 2019. You folks want a minute to give it a quick perusal?
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Unanimous for the record. Setting of the next budget subcommittee meeting. So, do we wanna have one, I guess the question really is, do we wanna have one before town meeting? Or do we wanna wait until after town meeting? It's really the big catalytic event coming up. The election is tomorrow. We scheduled one right before the election today, so we cover all those topics. How does the team feel? I'm sensitive to needs. It feels like an important next step, if there's time, would be to attend Thursday's school committee meeting. I think that's the next big piece of the budget discussion that will be had from a community standpoint. Do we wanna regroup after that as a team, to get together before town meeting? I see
You
some
could
bright,
s-
energetic
well, you could-
guys.
yes.
So
No, I was
Caroline's
thinking we should
in.
meet again tomorrow, but it's election day. No.
Okay. That's commitment, Caroline.
Listen. You guys are just such a delightful group, that's what I just think. I mean that sincerely, actually. No, I'm just thinking that we could set a tentative date, depending on how discussions go. I mean, we are still facing this very onerous task of
Mhm.
trying to get to a balanced budget, so, I mean, would it be possible to just set a tentative date
Yeah,
and
that's a great
then maybe
idea.
you and Leisha could decide together whether it's actually
Needed,
needed? Would that make sense?
but I'm fine with that.
Great idea, Caroline. So it'd be Monday, May 13th, which is a Board of Selectmen's meeting.
We're gonna do it the week before, so
The
we have
6th?
a couple of weeks in case there's something else we need to
Does
take
that
care
sound
of
good?
I might not be able to do that,
on the sixth.
but yeah, I might have a meeting, another board meeting that I need to go to.
Okay.
So what about the 13th? Is that a problem?
It is, cause we have
There's selectmen's meeting
Oh,
that
if we
night.
met earlier? Is that not possible?
that would not be possible for my schedule, unfortunately, that day.
Well, it doesn't have to be a Monday, right?
I can do, Tuesday the 14th.
I can't do the 14th. But that doesn't mean,
How about-
everybody else can do it, that's, you know.
Tuesday the 14th, we have the municipal building committee meeting.
Too many meetings.
I'll tell you what, how about, The 13th, 5 to 6.
You said you couldn't do.
Maybe I'll make it a phone conference.
That,
I won't be able to be here, but as long as Caroline can be.
No, it looks like
it's,
Connor can't.
we have,
We get prep and everything.
there's yes, for the selectmen's meeting at 6 and at 5 already, we're prepping the agenda for the meeting the week after for selectmen.
What about any other day the week of the sixth?
Thursday the 9th.
Can you do that?
We have negotiations until six.
We have negotiations
But we
on
can
Monday?
meet after the six.
6:30.
No, we could do, we could just end them, we could just say that we can only do a certain amount of time.
What negotiations do we have? I'm gonna need the,
So what,
6:30
6?
Thursday the 9th.
6 or 6:30? What's,
Can we do 6, or
Well,
is
they
that
have to
too, that's
end the
now
meeting at 6
6:30?
and be here at 6, right? So
We agreed to have 2-hour.
Oh, I don't remember.
So 6:30, okay?
So, yeah.
6:30, May 9th, tentative.
Yeah, it's 10. Oh.
Public participation has been pretty active throughout, but we certainly have a last line item agenda, which we are grateful for that participation. Any last public participation? Excellent. So with that, I will take a motion to adjourn.
So move.
Second.
All those in favor? Excellent. Meeting adjourned.
so it's 6 or 6:30? 6:30.
Well, that was fun.